Welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. My name is Travis Jameson, and I'm your host. I'm also a pastor at Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church, as well as an author of my new book, The Mystery of Faith: Why the Gospel is Still Good News. I encourage you to go and check it out. It's available wherever you buy books. On today's episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, I have the privilege to welcome Helen Bond onto the show. Helen Bond is not related to James Bond, as far as I know, but she is the professor of Christian origins at the University of Edinburgh, as well as the author of numerous books, including The First Biography of Jesus, Genre and Meaning Making in Mark's Gospel, and most recently, Women Remembered, Jesus' Female Disciples, which she wrote with Joan Taylor. And she's also the host of her own podcast called The Biblical Time Machine, and I encourage you to look that podcast up. It is amazing. But for now, let's dive into my episode with Helen Bond. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. Helen, it is so great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited too, because you're all the way in Edinburgh. So this is a real long distance podcast today. So I'm grateful for the technology to make it possible. Well, I'd love to get to know you a little bit more. So why don't we start with just telling us a little bit about you're in Edinburgh. What do you do on your day-to-day basis? And what are you up to these days?
Well, I'm Professor of Christian Origins here at Edinburgh, which is just a different way of saying New Testament, really. But a lot of people calling themselves Christian Origins now rather than New Testament, because I'm really a historian of early Christianity. So I'm interested in the first century or so of the Christian movement and the whole context, the sort of first century Judea, first century BC as well. So I'm interested in Josephus's works, Herod the Great, the Roman occupation, things like that. So it's a bit broader, I suppose, than New Testament. But largely what I do on a day-to-day basis with the students is teaching them about various books of the New Testament or historical Jesus and things like that.
And at a public university like Edinburgh, are you teaching undergraduate courses like to a wide variety of students, or are you mostly working with like PhD students?
Both, actually. And Scotland is unusual in that the Church of Scotland trains its ministers in universities. So the vast majority of our students, our undergraduate students, will be entirely secular students who just think it's interesting, and we also have a kind of sort of liberal arts degree. So people will come here to do, for example, history, and they'll have to do two other subjects with it. So a lot of people might do, they might do a bit of divinity, as we call it, or theology with history or with English or something like that. So a lot of people do it as an outside subject. Quite often they change because they get the bug and they realize that it's the best subject there is. So so it can be a wide range of people. There will be some people training for ministry, either in the Church of Scotland or another church. Most people sort of just doing it out of interest. And then at postgraduate level, we have master's students and also PhD students, most of whom are overseas, actually. So we kind of change the group of people at postgrad level, and they will be doing research in a particular topic to do with anything to do with Christian origins, really.
Oh, that's so cool. That's so exciting that undergrad students get to be exposed to that, and then some get really interested in it. That's
that's one of the best things when you see somebody because also in our sort of public schools nowadays, people don't really do very much Bible stuff. So they maybe come to university and they're thinking, even if they're wanting to do divinity, they're doing religion sort of broadly, and it's ethics and philosophy of religion that people do at school, and so maybe they haven't really done much Bible Bible, and they'd sort of do it as an extra subject, and then seeing them suddenly kind of get that bug and then carrying on to second year. And I've seen a few people who have completely changed and, specialized in biblical studies and then maybe gone on and done masters and PhD work. And yeah, that's really nice when you see them kind of, I suppose, because it's my own subject, I like to see them being interested in the same stuff.
Well, that makes me think I should ask you, how did you get the bug?
I got the bug at school, strangely, because and probably not the way you might imagine, because I mean, I was brought up in the Church of England. We went to church every week, and that was just sort of there. And I was just doing religion as a kind of an extra because I wanted to do maths at university, and I loved puzzles and things like that. And I was going to do maths and maybe work in a bank or something like that. I wasn't quite sure. And then we did this thing called the synoptic problem, which is about the literary relationship between Mark's Gospel and Matthew and Luke. The idea that Matthew and Luke have both used Mark in the composition of their own gospel. And if you look at passages put together, you can actually see what's happening. Even in an English translation, you can see that they've used Mark, and then you can start to see, oh, they've added this, and they've taken that one away, and you can build up a picture of what Matthew is doing and what Luke is doing. And somehow, because I like puzzles and things, this just completely appealed to me, and it was sort of like that detective thing, and you could see what they were doing. So bizarrely, a lot of people find the synoptic problem really, really boring. But for me, it was the thing that made me think, oh, I'm going to carry on with this and do sort of a little bit more. And I kept just doing a little bit more. And then finally, I just decided that this was far more interesting than maths. And that's what I wanted to do at university. I mean, my parents did think it was an odd choice. It's one thing to have a daughter who's going to do maths and everyone says, oh, she must be clever. And then, oh, well, she's doing religion. She must be mad. So,
Yeah.
But,
yeah, it turns out it doesn't make for popular conversation at the graduation party when you're like, yeah, I'm going to go study the Bible.
I know people do that. People have such, I don't know, I think the problem is people don't know anything about it though. Their ideas are just formed from, I don't know, Sunday school classes or going to the church when they were very little, and they think it's just about hearing little stories and sort of regurgitating them in some way, or looking for sort of religious meanings in stories. And what for me is exciting about this, about studying religion, is that it covers everything. I like literature, I like languages, I like philosophy, I like social history and all of these things, and you can do all of them if you do religion. So it's the best subject.
That is such a great way to put it. I think that's one of the reasons I'm constantly pulled into studying the Bible, theology. It does reach every area of life, and everything can relate to it in some way or another.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing that people, hear, that the Bible isn't just this old book that with these like nice Bible stories with Noah and the ark and the rainbow and everything. It's like it's so complex, and it's so connected to so many different areas of study. And so
It's got real intellectual depth too. I think that's the
yeah.
thing too, that people think, oh, it's not a proper subject. There's nothing really hard about studying
Mm.
divinity because you're just regurgitating stuff, but actually it has real sort of emotional and intellectual depth to it. So that's another reason for putting it on
Yeah.
that number one spot.
Well, even you mentioned the synoptic, what did you call it? The
The
synoptic
synoptic problem. Yeah.
problem. That's right. And it is interesting, as I've learned about that over the years, I find the more you study the history of the New Testament and what was going on and how it was being put together, I always come away with like, yes, we confess that this is a divine book, a sacred book, but it's so human too. Like, and the more you get to know it, the more you're like, wow, these biblical writers, they were almost just like you and me. Like it's like they were really real human beings that were dealing with complex issues, trying to tell a good story and trying to tell it in a way that was compelling and met their audience where they were at. But I think most people don't quite know that about the Bible.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what's really fascinating about the New Testament for me is seeing these people trying to work out what does it mean to be followers of Jesus in this particular time and place. And we can
Hmm.
piece together a lot about, I mean, actually a huge amount about first century Judea from the writings of Josephus. We're so lucky that we've got two big books from Josephus that chronicle what was happening at the time. And of course, there's been loads of archaeology done as well. So we know a lot about this time and place. And then reading these texts from people who are still Jewish, but trying to work out now what does it mean to be Jewish, but also following this person we think is the Messiah. And then that sort of journey that this movement goes on as it gradually kind of pulls apart over several centuries. I mean, it's a much slower thing than people tended to think, I think, in the past.
Yeah.
But all of that thing about identity and who are we, who's a Jew, who's a Christ follower, when do the two things become distinct, and how do they work out what it is that's important about Jesus and what they want to say about Jesus, long before there's Gospels and even longer before there's creeds. So
Hmm.
all of that stuff I think is really interesting, and almost anything that you're interested in, if it's network theory, game theory, any of these theories and ways of looking at texts can actually illuminate something or other. So yeah, lots of stuff to look at, whatever your interests are.
Yes, yes. Well, so a lot of our listeners are in the tech world of Silicon Valley, and so I'd be interested to hear how can from them after they listen to this. I want to hear from them. How is their training as scientists or engineers? How can that help them illuminate the Bible? Because it can, and it brings a different perspective than per se a theologian or a pastor, even because they just come from a different background. So you're right. It's so helpful. Um, so today I want to talk to you about your work on biography and ancient biographies. I think, of course, if you asked anyone on the street today, what's a biography, they would just say, oh, it's just a book that someone writes about another person's life. Like it's just the story of someone's life. Um, and yet, when I read your article, you wrote an article in this book called Behind the Scenes of the New Testament. And he wrote an article about ancient biography, and I was I found it so interesting learning more about the biography and how it was used in the ancient world. And it seems to be quite a bit different than how biographies are used today at times. And so I was wondering if we can start by what are the characteristics of an ancient biography in Greek and Roman society?
Well, a little bit like the ones today, they tend to be a sort of a historical type narrative that focuses on a person. So, they're still the life of a person. And in fact, the Greek word bios just means a life, or way of life, somebody's life that you're talking about. Where they're different, though, is in a couple of ways. First of all, these people are writing long before Freud told us that your upbringing was important. So they do sometimes include somebody's upbringing, but not because they think that childhood events are going to influence you as an adult. They sometimes tell childhood events because they're sort of like a little window onto what the person is going to be like later. And we have one in the Bible, the story of Jesus in the temple when he's 12 years old in Luke's gospel, and he's already there teaching the teachers of the law, and he's already kind of, this great wise person even at age 12. And that's a typical kind of story you get in a biography that sort of tells you it's a little sort of early foreshadowing of what they're going to be like later. But the main way in which they're different to modern biographies is that they are all about morality. So ancient biographies tell you about somebody's way of life, usually from cradle to grave, or in the case of a teacher, maybe, just the ministry, as we have in the case of Jesus. And they tell you about their life, and the idea is to kind of hold up that life as a model, an example that you are going to follow. So usually an example of, virtue. you occasionally get ones that are written as, an example of vice and telling you
Mm.
what to avoid in your own life. But mostly they're written as examples of good behavior that people then kind of read and see how they ought to behave. So you get these a lot. Often they're used in sort of schooling. There you might get small examples of people's lives, and young boys in particular would learn them and take them to heart. Greek biography is often about teachers, philosophers, that kind of thing, whereas Latin biography, Roman biography, or vitae tends to be about statesmen and generals, and then in the imperial period tends to be about emperors in particular, because
Mm.
by the first century the emperor was the only person you wanted to write about. He is top dog. Whereas Greek biography tended to be still writing about philosophers. And the Gospels, of course, are Greek biographies. So they're very much in this sort of tradition of writing a story about a philosopher or a teacher, holding up his life as an example to follow and encouraging people to follow that life. And also, I suppose, because, they would have been read by groups of people who are interested in this kind of thing, there's a certain amount of group formation and identity formation in all of that. We are the people who revere this leader. This is the person who's important for our group. So different groups, Pythagoreans might have a life of Pythagoras, and along with his writings, and so the followers of Jesus have these books about Jesus too.
Would you be able to name like what's one of the most famous ancient biographies for the Greeks?
Yeah, I mean, one it's early third century, so it's a little bit later than the time of Jesus. But Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana is it's a lot longer than the Gospels. It's about 7 books in total, but it's
Wow.
about this philosopher who sort of wanders about. He has disciples. He exorcises demons from various people. He even raises somebody from the dead in a scene that's very like the story of the raising of the widow of Nain's son in Luke. So similar, and it ends with a big trial narrative, and there's some uncertainty about where the body is at the end. So a lot of
Oh,
similarity
fascinating.
in that one. Yeah, I mean, at one point people did wonder whether there was any sort of literary connection. Does Philostratus know the Gospels? But I think that view has sort of gone out of fashion nowadays. I mean, another one would be Lucian's Life of Demonax. He's a second century writer. He sort of holds up the life of his teacher for other people to revere. You get a lot of biographies in Plutarch, for example. Various people there get sort of held up as examples of virtue, and Plutarch likes to put 2 biographies together so that you can sort of compare and contrast them.
Ah, yes.
And you get that actually in Luke's gospel right at the very beginning, where you have that, the birth
Mhm.
stories, where you have the birth of Jesus and the birth of John the Baptist. And, there's no heavy handed, oh, John was not so good as Jesus. But, as you're reading it, you realize that at every step, Jesus is just that little bit better than John. And you kind of make
Yeah.
your mind as to, who's the
Same
great.
with Mary and Zachariah, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So John is born to an old barren couple, but that's happened in the Old Testament before. That's
Mhm.
nothing special. Whereas Jesus is born to a virgin who doesn't know a man. So even more special for Jesus. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the things that you get in the Gospels, you see similarities in these ancient biographies.
And when you talk about the virtues, what were some of those virtues that they were aspiring to be like?
Yeah, so they're the typical sort of Greco-Roman virtues, I suppose, of the day, and so they're things like piety, which usually means looking after your parents, looking after doing the right things by the gods, doing the right things by your parents, It can be compassion. It can be moderation. That's a very important quality in the first century. It can be being a benefactor, doing good for other people. And so all of these are sort of typical virtues that are sort of held up. I mean, so it can also be things like courage and warlikeness and things like
Hmm.
that, but I mean they're less relevant, I think, for the Gospels. And some biographies sort of will be quite heavy-handed about it and say, he was very pious, and then tell you a story of his piety. He was very moderate, and tell you a story about his moderation. But most of them don't tend to be like that. They tend to just sort of show you rather than tell you. So they give you a series of stories, and you take it from that you see the person's character from that, which again is more the kind of thing that you have in the Gospels, where you sort of see Jesus's character in action. And I know that's not the way we normally think about the Gospels. We don't really think they're about character, Jesus's character, because that's after sort of however many hundred years of the creed, we're thinking that they're about telling us that he's God. But I mean, I think identity and character are quite closely linked. So they are also about showing you a way of life as exemplified by Jesus. So Jesus is pious, he's compassionate, he's moderate, he's a great benefactor, he feeds the 5,000. He helps people, he puts them out of their misery when he's exorcising people, he heals people, he's all of these positive things, all of these virtues that he embodies.
Yeah, I if he's meant to, yeah, it's the I think people do think of the gospel stories as telling us what to believe about God.
Mm, mm.
And certainly the gospels say that Jesus reveal who God is. But yeah, the only way to reveal is to see the story and to see
Yeah, yeah,
what was he like. If he's supposed to be God, then we got to see what God is like.
yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, I think that's really powerful in the gospels. Um, yeah, it's interesting that these ancient biographers were writing in ways that made sense to them. So, like, would Matthew, Mark, Luke, would they have been writing, like, they would have probably read some of these ancient biographies and have thought, we're going to put together some biographies about Jesus. Is that kind of how you imagine what would have happened?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, biography was very, very popular at the time, particularly in the first century, because of the emperor. Everyone is suddenly interested in the great man. Looking
Mm,
for great men as examples, and there's plenty of evidence for. Augustus put up a whole series of statues in the Forum at Rome with a few sort of words about this is so and so, he did great stuff and these are the great things he did. So that idea of looking up to great men, seeing great men as examples is really, really fashionable at the time, and biography is a very popular sort of literary form at the time. Not just the elite, which I mean most of the examples we have still extant are written by the elite, but presumably they sort of percolate down too. So we have things like the life of Aesop, which is seems to be much more at a lower register that ordinary people are sort of having a bit of a laugh at. It's not quite so serious perhaps as some of the other ones. So it's all around them. So whether they've
mm,
read them or just heard them, and I think once they want to start writing, they're writing about 40 years or so after the death of Jesus. Stories are starting to get forgotten. It's probably becoming important that we're talking about this person, Jesus, but who was he? What does he stand for? What is it that people are following? What do followers of his need to do? What do they have to be like? And I think in that sort of environment, writing a biography of Jesus to say, this is who he was, this is what he stood for, this is what his way of life was like, go and do the same, would have made a lot of sense. And of course, you have to remember too that these are people, although they're writing a Greek biography, they are coming from a Jewish worldview too. So although sometimes, they may not be quite, they may not hold exactly the same virtues and interests as Greek writers. Some of the things are kind of transposed into a Jewish setting where certain other virtues might be seen as important. But I think still, they're writing in Greek in a milieu where biography writing is just very, very common. So, why not start to write biographies about Jesus?
And given their Jewish background, was biographies common in the Jewish tradition as well?
No, no, this is a really
Oh,
strange thing. And this is,
okay.
yeah, no, this is, I think something that perhaps hasn't been sort of, noted as much as it could be. Biography is not common in the Jewish world. So
Hmm.
you get the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew Bible is very interested in character and the character of largely great men. So, you have the cycle of stories around Joseph, for example, or Abraham or Moses. But you get very, very few biographies in Judaism. Nearly always, the biography is part of a much longer story about God's dealings with Israel. So, the story of Moses is not a story about Moses on its own, but it's a story about God and Israel, and Moses just happens to be, an important character within
Mhm.
that wider story. So you do get the occasional biography. Somebody like Philo of Alexandria, who wrote a biography of Moses, so called it the Life of Moses. And you get one or two other things. Josephus wrote his history of the Jews, his Jewish antiquities, as a sort of a series of biographies. Just sort of one big character after another. Although that again, it was part of a wider history. But generally speaking, no, Jews didn't tend to write biographies. So I think this is just the very beginning
Hmm.
of that sort of movement away. Christian or Christ following literature from sort of the 70s onwards starts to write specific stories about Jesus. Whereas Jews don't really do that. You have Philo, but then you never have any, you don't get any biographies from Qumran. You don't get any biographies of the Maccabees, people like that. You have one and two Maccabees that covers the whole sort of revolt and the dynasty, but you could easily have a biography about Judas Maccabeus, but you
Mhm.
don't. And then when you get into rabbinic times, again, you have all those stories and anecdotes. You could easily write a biography about any of the rabbis, but they don't. And one of the suggestions out there is that this sort of certainly as time goes on, this Jewish reluctance to embrace biography is partly driven by the fact that Christians have been very keen on biography, and it's sort of a way of separating. But it may also be the case that writing a book about, a religious book about a person, particularly a person from the recent past, just didn't really sit right with first century
Hmm.
Jews. If you were going to write a book about a person at all, it would have to be somebody like Moses. And even that sort of maybe felt wrong because it was giving a person too much status.
Hmm.
Nearly all Jewish literature is really much broader and about God and the people. It
Mhm.
doesn't focus on individuals to that same extent that Greek and Roman biography did, and I think that's an important move that Christians start to make. First of all, with Mark's gospel, and then Matthew, Luke, and then John, and this sort of focusing on a person, putting a person from the recent past right in the center of God's dealings with humans, I think is quite a big move.
Mhm. And it's interesting that they didn't want to do biographies about, different characters throughout the Hebrew Bible. But then this Jesus shows up and is identifying as God, and it's like all of a sudden they want to do a biography on God in some ways. Like and that's kind of just an interesting difference too. It's like the whole story was about God and Israel, and now God's here, and we're going to do a biography on him, which is,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm not sure that the earliest though did think of Jesus as God in the
Mm,
way that Christians would understand that today. I mean, certainly by the time you get to John's gospel and he says, you know, the word was with God, the word was God. I mean,
yeah.
there's an identification there. But in Mark's gospel, Jesus is the Son of God, the beloved Son, and he's clearly a figure that is in some way divine, or certainly by the end, when he sort of rises up and sits at the right hand of God the Father, he
Mm,
seems to be a divine figure there. But I think at this very, very early stage, it's not yet clear, you know, the whole sort of creedal Chalcedon
yeah.
declaration of the fourth century. People are still sort of working out, you know, how does Jesus fit into this? He's obviously a prophet, he's the Son of Man, whatever that means, he's the Son of God, you know, they want to say ever more exalted things about him, but I don't think they're quite there. I mean, certainly not there in terms of the sort of second person of the Trinity that will be worked out by the fourth century.
And that kind of, I think, gets at the difference between the different gospels, that there's different emphases within them. So how would you describe like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are what are their particular focuses? If it starts with Mark, like what was Mark trying to communicate about Jesus, and then the other ones?
So I mean, I think Mark is really interesting because he's the first. So
Yeah.
that's why I've spent most time looking at him. I think for him, I mean, he starts the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think what he's saying is that prior to Mark, the gospel, certainly when Paul talks about the gospel, he means the oral proclamation about Jesus's death and resurrection. You know, it's the event around about the cross and the grave and the resurrection. That's kind of what he means by gospel.
Mm,
Paul has very little at all to say about Jesus's life. Every now and then there's a little bit, but really the life of Jesus is not particularly important to Paul. Whereas for Mark, I think Mark realizes that actually there's not just the cross and the resurrection, there's the whole of the life, and if you present a biography, you can kind of, you know, tell the life of Jesus, tell people the way he led his life, and then encourage them to kind of follow in his footsteps. So I mean, everything is focused on Jesus in Mark's gospel. Almost he's the subject of nearly every verb. You know, that's really pretty incredible, and points, you know, just how important Jesus is in all of this. So I think he's writing to underline that he's the Son of God. He's got this very close relationship with God, to tell us something about the type of life that he led. And, you know, this refrain, follow me, keeps coming up all the time. Devote to your life to Jesus. And then I think clearly Mark's gospel was very popular in its day. It made its mark, it spread widely. And I think other people liked it, but clearly living in slightly different contexts, they thought, you know, they wanted to tweak it a bit,
mm,
add things, make things a little bit different. So Matthew is generally thought of as being more Jewish. He seems to be writing for his intended audience are Christians who are still following the law, still very much seeing themselves as Jews. And so there's, you know, many aspects of Matthew's gospel seem to be adding more sort of Jewish reflection than Mark. Luke's gospel, he clearly has in mind a second work. He's going to chart the sort of the spread of Christianity from the very beginning, from John the Baptist through to its final arrival in Rome. And so, you know, he's got this sort of, he's writing much more as a kind of a Greco-Roman author. He's very interested in setting the whole thing in terms of imperial events. So he has the census, he has a few references to emperors and things like that. And then John, I think John does know the other Gospels too. John really changes them quite a lot, because I think by
mhm.
the time John is writing, possibly around about 100, maybe even later than that, it's very clear then that the second coming isn't going to come quite as soon as as certainly Mark thought it was, and so he has to kind of orientate things, whereas Mark keeps talking about the kingdom of God is coming. In John's gospel, it's, believe and you'll have eternal life. It's something that you
Mhm.
can have now when you believe. And, again, various other changes that are made, because I think we're in a slightly later time now where it's clear that things are going to be a bit different and Christians are going to be in the world for a longer time. So I think each of the gospel writers changes what he inherits, so that it speaks more closely to his own context. And again, that was something that was quite normal in biographies. You can have lots of biographies of Pythagoras, for example, or Socrates, each of them speaking to different communities.
Yeah, it strikes me they sound pastoral in that way, in the sense that they're trying to meet the needs of their communities and communicate a message, communicate about Jesus, but in a way that actually makes sense to the people.
Absolutely. I think the evangelists were amazing people. Not only were they really great literary artists, but they are clearly writing with great pastoral concern too.
Mm.
And I mean, in Mark's gospel again, there's sort of recurring stuff about persecution, and it seems to be written for a group of people, or again with a target audience of people who are experiencing difficulty. There's a lot in Mark about you might be rejected by your family. Jesus is rejected by his family. So there's a real sense that this is going to be helpful for the people who are hearing this story, because a lot of what they've gone through themselves has also been experienced by Jesus.
Mm. What about the other gospels out there? I mean, I think of, people have probably heard of the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
Like why don't those to make the cut? Are they worth even reading, or what's going on there?
Yeah, certainly. They're definitely worth reading. And a lot of them, were not considered heretical. It's just that they didn't, as you say, make the cut. And in the second century already, it the church fathers were discussing, which of the gospels and why are there four. These four seem to have been the earliest ones, and they seem to have been the ones certainly that were spreading widely and that were most read in the churches. So it wasn't really a top down, it was a bottom up. These are the ones that the
Mm.
churches are reading, that Christ followers are finding useful. And so Irenaeus in in the second century, was trying to work out, how do we make sense of this? And he said there's four gospels, like there's four winds, four corners of the universe. And so this idea that there were four, and they each showed different aspects of Jesus and his life. That so relatively quickly, this idea that there were four and only four became dominant. And there are lots and lots of other gospels, most of them written slightly later, though not always very much later. Some of them are put together by groups that were later declared to be heretical. Some of them are slightly Gnostic. These people with this sort of philosophical Neoplatonic ideas about knowledge and things like that. But most of them are just, perfectly fine. You have things like the Proto-Evangelium of James,
Mm.
which is a prequel to the Gospels and gives you Mary's backstory and tells you actually a lot of the details that we still associate with Christmas, like the names of Mary's mother and father. Animals animals at the stable, although Jesus is born in a cave in that text. But
Hmm.
lots of sort of just interesting stuff that people wanted to know more about the life of Jesus and the life of people in the story of Jesus, and so these things were written. Most of them are perfectly fine. They just didn't make that cut of 27 that we decided in the early fourth century again, that this was the body of authoritative texts.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. What about like autobiography? in the ancient world, or memoir. Like I feel like that's very common in our day. Lots of memoirs come out. And I think of, when I think of not Jesus's day, but later on, Augustine's Confessions was kind of an example of autobiography. What was there any that of that kind of writing?
Yes, there was. There was. I mean, the problem is a lot of it's not come down to us. So the
Hmm.
earliest, I think, the earliest extant autobiography is actually Josephus's life, um, and that's a sort of I mean that's his own account of his activities in the Jewish war, because clearly opponents had been saying negative things about him, and so he wrote to put the record straight. Um, so it's about himself, and it's really about his war record. We do get memoirs. There's all sorts of stories about Roman generals, Roman emperors writing memoirs, and just accounts of things that they've done. So I mean, you get a lot of first person writing, but I suppose it's it takes a while before it's anything like the kind of thing that we would recognize as an autobiography.
Hmm. So as we finish up our conversation, I just wondered if you have any tips for Christian readers today or readers in general of the Gospels. How can understanding them as an ancient form of biography inform their reading of it? How would it allow them to approach it in a way that does justice to that reality?
I think for me, one of the really interesting things about looking at the Gospels as biography is looking at the structure of ancient biographies, because they tend to be sort of, a series of anecdotes, which is exactly what we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Um, and so it at first it can seem very random. It's just one story after another, and then he went here and then he went there and then this happened and that happened and somebody came up to him, blah 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 blah. It's just one story after another. But nearly always, and certainly in the Gospels, I think the placement and juxtaposition of these little anecdotes is really important.
Hmm.
And this is one thing that I learned a lot. I wrote a book about this, and I had lots of happy times comparing and contrasting these anecdotes. So if you and one of the troubles is when we listen to bits of the Gospels being read out in church, people tend to just, they just read one of those anecdotes, and you don't
Hmm.
get to know what's just happened and what's coming afterwards. But what's really interesting, I think, is if you look at what just happened beforehand and what happened afterwards, and then think about why has the author put them in this order? What is he trying to do? So, for example, in Mark's Gospel, the story of the death of John the Baptist, um, and that horrible story of this sort of elite male
Yes.
banquet and the dancing girl and all of that stuff, that comes just before the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. So again, another banquet by another king, although he's not called that at this point. But Herod is called King Herod, even though the commentators will say, oh, he wasn't a king. But Mark, about 6 or 7 times, he keeps saying king, king, king.
Mhm.
And then you have the story of Jesus with this sort of great banquet, for anybody, not just the elite, but anybody, and thousands of people come and they're all served. And in a way, it's a story of two different banquets. And a
Mm.
question is, who is the real king here? And when you see these stories kind of put together like that and allow your imagination to sort of move between them and across them and make comparisons, I think you see more and more depths to the gospel stories. They're not just these isolated little accounts, but very carefully put together, and they are saying far more than you actually think they are.
Mm. Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's so helpful to think about that, to hold the context of all of these stories together, and that the gospel writers they were putting this context together. It's not just a mechanical recording of every step of Jesus, but it's a story well told through the voice of the gospel writers. So that's a really helpful way to think about approaching the gospels. Well, Helen, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciated this conversation. I feel like I learned a lot, even though I had done some reading before. I feel like, man, there is so much to learn about the ancient world, especially that little bit about how the Jewish tradition did not have many biographies. I must have missed that. And I think that's just fascinating to think about more. So thank you so much. And hopefully we'll have you again another time because I know you're a wealth of knowledge. You have your own podcast, which I highly recommend to our audience, The Biblical Time Machine, in which you go to all different places throughout history to study the Bible. And you have a great co-host, David, and you guys invite scholars of all kinds, both on the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, to discuss all kinds of topics. There was, I've listened, my wife and I are huge fans, and we've listened to, so many episodes at this point that I probably mix up all the details in my head. But it really does, it's so helpful because it gives me, the more I listen about the history of the ancient world, it gives me a broader imagination as I'm reading the Bible, as I have to preach from the Bible for sermons and things. It just gives me this wealth of imagination to be like, this is such a living world. So thank you for your good work in that, Helen.
Thank you. It's been great to talk to you. And thank you for mentioning the podcast too.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, like and subscribe and pass it on to a friend. We want more people to know about these great conversations.